I know the Cultural Events Board is excited to see so many people here tonight. We have been anticipating this night for a long time, and through some bumps and turns, we're finally here. CEB hopes that this night can begin to spark a dialogue on this campus and hopefully a greater movement towards equality and cultural understanding. We strongly believe that the Reverend Al Sharpton will help just do that. The Reverend Alfred Charles Al Sharpton, Jr. was born October 3rd, 1954, and is a Pentecostal minister, a political activist, civil rights leader, and a film actor. Reverend Al Sharpton is a fire orator and activist from New York City. As a child, Sharpton became an ordained minister and was known as the Boy Wonder, preacher of the Washington Temple Church of God. In the 1970s and 80s, he worked with boxing promoter Don King. Then he became well known to New Yorkers as a guy who always seems to be in the middle of hot-button racial issues. Our campus has been ridden with many acts of intolerance and discrimination, ranging from graffiti benches calling for the death to all homosexuals to an email death threat to one of our Black tri-executives. The Cultural Events Board was hoping to bring an individual who has been a champion of civil rights and the fair and equal treatment of all human beings, a culture we felt was severely underrepresented on this campus. Reverend Sharpton has been that voice for many years. In 1971, Sharpton founded the National Youth Movement to fight drugs and raise money for impoverished youth. In 1991, Sharpton founded the National Action Network to increase voter education, services aiding the poor, supporting economically small community businesses, confronting racism in violation of civil and human rights, among many other initiatives. It is this spirit of activism and will to toil so others may live more prosperously that we have invited the Reverend to speak at our university. We invite the students, faculty, and staff of CU Boulder, as well as our surrounding community members, to join in the dialogue and bring your views to the table so that we as a community can grow and evolve into a more accepting and diverse community. Now it is my esteemed pleasure to introduce the Reverend Al Sharpton.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say that I'm very happy and honored to be here tonight. And before starting, I want to say two things. One, I sincerely am sorry that I was not here on the scheduled date last week. I was in Atlanta for the funeral of Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and I'm very happy that you were able to give me the date of coming back tonight and that many of you came back with me. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is, unlike most public figures in America, I believe that people ought to be honest and say what they mean and mean what they say. I do not speak or go places to seek the approval of people. I go hoping that we can have an honest dialogue and at the end of the evening understand one another. So if there are those that come tonight that don't like me, when you leave and you still don't like me, I hope you sleep well tonight, because I will. Because I did not come to be liked. I came for us to have a dialogue. And I'm not going to say what I think people want to hear. I'm going to say what I believe, and I hope that you will say or ask what you believe, and that if we do not agree, we can at least agree to disagree in a civil and in a constructive way, because this country will not, in my judgment, ever become as great as it can be until we can have a fair exchange of honest dialogue. The issues that have surrounded the discussions of cultural diversity and race and politics are always emotional issues. Why? Because it always touches people where they live. But it is healthier and better, and in the long run, more constructive to put them out front and deal with them, rather than to have them as the unspoken thing that we're all concerned about, but not mature enough to discuss. Many people lack the maturity to have those kind of reasonable discussions. And I would hope that we get beyond that in this country. Now, I was told that part of what was said that we're going to discuss tonight is, when will a black man become president of the United States? And Clearly, I was hoping it was in 2004. But I will still try to have the discussion without having it too subjective. I do, however, want to start by saying in the last 6 months, I was finding myself preaching at the funeral and speaking at the funeral of 2 of the funerals of Rosa Parks and speaking at the wake of Coretta Scott King and attending her funeral, which brought back to this nation, in many ways, the civil rights movement of the 60s and the 50s. I having come in the aftermath of that and being youth director in New York of Dr. King's organization after his death, knew a lot more about that movement from those that were the real participants. And it amazes me the distortions that we have seen in the media and the distortion of activities that we have seen around these events that we have in many ways began to redo in the projection of history, actually what happened. And I think it's instructive if we're honest about what happened, because then we can see in a better light what you and I go through today and what many will go through in the future around this question of race and diversity. The civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s was around the issues of discrimination that were both legal as well as led by those that, in my judgment, were vigilantes that were protected by laws and protected by agreements that emboldened them to rob people of their civil and human rights. So we start in the 50s, where Rosa Parks sat on a bus. But the issues of discrimination and segregation went way back until blacks were first brought here to these shores. The issue that Rosa Parks brought to bear was not an issue that was applauded and universally acclaimed like it was when she died. It was amazing to me to see the president and others mourn Rosa Parks. 4 presidents attend Coretta Scott King's funeral. But when I was your age, I remembered that half of those presidents openly opposed the federal holiday for Martin Luther King. So in death, a lot of acclaim and support was given these women that they never enjoyed in the high point of their public career. The reason I say that is that many that you would deem maybe even on campus as people that are, quote, controversial, will be the ones that will make society move forward and will be appreciated in the long run, rather than those that go along to get along and those that go along with the status quo and don't have the courage to stand up and do what is right. Coretta, for the media, this is hot coffee, not alcohol. I just want to be clear. Somebody will write tomorrow and he got some booze brought to him 5 minutes into his speech. You always have to watch the media. That's half the problem, but I'll get to that. Coretta Scott King was an activist all of her life. Coretta Scott King marched against the war in Korea when she was a student at Antioch College before she ever met Martin Luther King. So when she met Dr. King in Boston, when she was studying music at the Boston Conservatory and he was finishing his doctorate at Boston University, there was this coming together of 2 people from the South, both who had been victimized by segregation, both who had been victimized by discrimination, both who had come out of a hardcore Jim Crow society that combined in marriage and decided they would go back to the Deep South. He to pastor a church, her to help him and to build a family, and they ran into what became the civil rights struggle of that time. The reason I raise that is sexism tries to reduce Coretta Scott King to just the wife of Martin Luther King, like she had no mind and no will of her own. But the other reason I raise that is if you understood the commitment to world peace and nonviolence and the quest against war of Coretta Scott King, you would find it, as I did, a little ironic that George Bush would sit center stage at her funeral when much of what he has represented has been the opposite of what she advocated most of her life. Now, do I think George Bush should have been there? Yes. But do I think that those that were there should have been limited in what remarks they would have had to say? No. It is ironic to me he was there, but it is insulting to act as though, as some of the right-wing media has acted, that the purpose of the services was to comfort George Bush rather than remember Coretta Scott King. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that they openly chastised Jimmy Carter and Joseph Lowry for bringing up the actual issues that Coretta Scott King lived for? They reprimanded Jesse Jackson and I for saying things the night before at the wake of Coretta Scott King, and they said that we politicized the funeral. Well, let's look at that a minute, because this will give you some instruction on what we're talking about tonight. Jimmy Carter said that Coretta Scott King was a courageous woman who even survived the wiretapping of her family and the abuse of government. That's what he said. The right wing said that was an attack on George Bush. Now, she was wiretapped by Democrats, namely the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration. If someone should have had taken a personal attack, it should have been Ted Kennedy who was sitting there, not George Bush. But if you are in a position where you think anyone talking about wiretapping and harassment must be talking about you, then it is obvious that it is your guilt more than the speaker's words that is the problem. First of all, Jimmy Carter had been president and had the right to say whatever he wanted to say. Second of all, George Bush Sr. had been opposed to the federal holiday of Martin Luther King, and in fact was lucky that we didn't boo him when he got up to speak, and it was only out of respect for Mrs. King and the memory of Mrs. King that many of us didn't remind him that he was at an affair that he probably had swore he would never have been to. In fact, if you remember, he said that he'd never seen anything like that in his life. You imagine a man had been president of the United States, president of a nation with 35 million African Americans, and he openly admits he had never seen a black church experience in his life. He is a former president, father of the present president, and doesn't know how blacks have church. And you don't think that is culturally frightening to many of us? Or George Bush, who got up and said that we must remember that Mrs. King could have retired and could have went and sat down after her husband was killed, but she decided to keep on fighting the cause of civil rights even after his death. Yes, and the reason she continued to fight is large part the policies of your father and you that kept it necessary to continue to fight civil rights issues. Example. The present president, in the wake of 2001's vicious, malicious, and despicable attack, September 11th, got on television and said we must go and get those that are guilty. Bin Laden, he said, was the culprit. I stand here tonight, almost 5 years later. Bin Laden is still at large. We've engaged in a war that has cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and we have not done any of what Bush has said in terms of the capture of Bin Laden. There has been some war on terrorism, there has been some people grabbed, but Bin Laden is still available. Now, when I was running for the presidency, I could never understand how, with all of the intelligence and resources we had, that this country could not find a man that we were told is on dialysis, hiding in the mountains of Afghanistan, that comes out every 3 or 4 months with a new video. Bin Laden has out more videos than Mary J. Blige. Yet, we are unable to find Bin Laden. But to make matters worse, we go to Iraq and we seek the capture of Saddam Hussein, and we seek to bring down the regime in Iraq. Why? When we are told that the Iraqi regime of Mr. Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and that we are in imminent danger. Now, I didn't go to the University of Colorado, but I do know what imminent means. Imminent means immediate, means right now, means we can be immediately in trouble. I said during the debates for president, I did not believe there were weapons of mass destruction. I was attacked by the right wing. And as we got more and more into Iraq, it became evident those weapons were not there. Now we have even the administration admitting they were not there. But then they changed the premise for the war and said, well, it doesn't matter whether he had weapons or not. He was a bad guy and he needed to go. Well, it does matter, because you told us that's why we were going to war in the wake of 9/11. And the American public supported you because we believed there were weapons there, and we were traumatized, and rightfully so, after the attack of 9/11. Now, to change the premise is to be dishonest to the American people. If I were to walk in this auditorium and scream to you, get out, we're in imminent danger, and everyone ran out into the outside areas, and when I came out, you'd say, Reverend Al, where's the danger? And I'd say, don't worry about it. You needed fresh air anyhow. You may need fresh air, but that wasn't the basis that you ran out of this room. So it was on a flawed to outright, in my judgment, dishonest premise that we went to war. Now, the reason why I bring this into the whole question of Mrs. King that I'm raising, and the question that will come into diversity and race tonight, is that this is at a time where we are told we do not have money to handle questions that are needed in this country, like health care, like the fact that prescription drugs had reached such high cost that seniors were actually going over the border to buy prescription drugs and risking breaking the law because they couldn't afford to pay their rent and to buy prescription drugs at the same time. We were at a time that we said we do not have the funds to do what we need to do to computerize public schools. We do not have the funds in urban areas, and we do not have the funds for infrastructure redevelopment, which would have included the levees in New Orleans. That money was sent to Iraq, seeking weapons that were not there. Those armed forces, over 2,000 Americans dead, tens of thousands of Iraqis dead, and this president standing there defending something that is indefensible. In the wake of that, as we fast forward to 2005, Labor Day weekend, Saturday, I am in front of his house with Cindy Sheehan, the mother of a young Iraqi serviceman that was killed, who had come and led a protest at his house in Crawford, Texas, seeking to ask the president about this war. As I am outside that day, I noticed on the remote trucks, the media trucks, that they are covering a hurricane that has hit New Orleans. And I'm watching this for two reasons. One, I have a lot of friends in New Orleans and a chapter of our organization, National Action Network, there. And two, because I am in Texas and I'm getting ready to leave and travel to Florida, and I would be affected in terms of my travel by this hurricane. Now, the reason I give you that detail is because 4 days later, President Bush said he was not aware of what Katrina was doing. And the reason I found that strange is if I was outside of his house watching the hurricane on television, I know there was nothing wrong with the media feed. So I could either assume that he is telling less than the truth, or that all the TV in the president's house don't work. Let's assume the White House didn't give him any information. Intelligence had totally broke down. All he needed was to do what we did. Watch CBS, ABC, NBC, CNN, or his beloved Fox, because all of them were covering the same thing. It seems to me very frightening that we have a president that can see weapons in Iraq that are not there, but can't see a hurricane in New Orleans that is there. So for 4 days, this hurricane ravaged through 3 states. Levees that they knew could not handle anything over a Hurricane 2 broke. People are flooded, killed, homes washed away. Some people had struggled and had kept these homes 3 and 4 generations. These are not beggars. These are not people that had done anything wrong. These are not people that even remotely were at fault for their condition. And the president sat in Crawford and did nothing. When he finally came out, he did not head to New Orleans or Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama. He did not head to Washington. He went to the West Coast to get an award, a guitar that some people were going to present to him. Then he took his guitar and went back to Washington. And after 4 days, said his first words on Katrina. By then, we had said he had to know. And there was absolute neglect here. And that we did not believe if the race and class of the majority of people affected had been different, that he would have been so indifferent. And roll out the right wing. They began attacking us. Of course he didn't know. Of course it was the mayor of New Orleans' fault. If it wasn't his fault, it was the governor of Louisiana's fault. And how dare we raise this issue and question the competence and integrity of the Bush administration? Well, the head of FEMA at the time, who was appointed by President Bush, who he referred to as Brownie since they were so cool, testified before the Senate last week that they did know. He said, I'm not going to be the sacrificial lamb here. He said, I told them, they knew, and nothing was done. He said that, in fact, I warned them early as Sunday that the thing that we in FEMA feared for 10 years is happening right now. Now, if you contrast the testimony of his own FEMA director, his inactivity in Louisiana, the fact that over 80% of that city of New Orleans was black, many poor, and 78% of the poor there black. Alabama and Mississippi, poor. First of all, the mayor of New Orleans could not do anything about a regional crisis. He only has jurisdiction over New Orleans. And I'm not saying he's not without fault, but he certainly does not control federal emergency for 3 states, nor does the governor of Louisiana. But the issue that I'm raising is that this president has gone out of his way to project an insensitivity when it comes to people of color. You add on top of that, he puts a judge on the Supreme Court, Alito, who was involved in an alumni association in Princeton that actively said they did not want women and people of color in that university. You have a clear record of a president that has leaned toward the insensitivity of people of color. It is not some illusion or some dream that we have. It is based on his own record. So if you look at that record and then look at his standing by the coffin of Rosa Parks in the Capitol Rotunda, and look at him standing there speaking at the funeral of Coretta Scott King, then you will understand why many of us say that this movement of civil rights that started decades ago must continue until there is absolute, unequivocally, the words spoken become the deeds that is done, and not just the rhetoric of justice and fairness, but the actuality. Many people talk about let's have peace, but you can't have peace until you have fairness. There is a difference between peace and quiet. Peace means that we are all treated fairly and justly, and we all can communicate on an even playing field. Quiet means shut up, don't bother me, I don't care how unfair it is, let's just shut up and let things continue the way they are. Never, ever submit to being quiet. Fight in a peaceful way to get real peace. And let me say while I'm on Katrina, one of the things that was most offensive to me is when they started calling the residents of New Orleans refugees. Here are people, taxpayers, homeowners, in their own land, being treated like they were beggars and bothering somebody. Today, not yesterday, today, FEMA said we're no longer going to pay hotel bills and motel bills for Katrina evacuees. I said, well, 5.5 months later, why are people still in hotels? When we went to those in New York, at the Radisson Hotel near Kennedy Airport, which if any of you are from New York or visited New York, know that's about 20 miles outside of Manhattan, they said we were never given any car fare or any funds at all to go into the city and seek employment or permanent housing. And we were told if we could find it on our own, they would give us the first 3 months. Where are you going to find a landlord that will rent you an apartment when you only guaranteed 3 months that you can pay them? You may get a job in those 3 months if you're lucky, and you can't even look for that if you don't have some outside charity give you car fare to look for a job because FEMA gave you no money. Now here you have this going on today, and there are lawyers all over the country trying to fight the evacuees not being put out of their motels and hotels at a time that Bush just got through mourning at the grave of Coretta Scott King. This is an inherent contradiction that must be dealt with openly in this country. People say to me, well, Reverend, that's back in the day. I'm talking about today. I'm not talking about 65. I'm talking about 05 and 06, today. We live in a society that we still have a gap based on race. The medium income level of a family of 4 white in this country is still 26% more than a family of black today. In America, today, you are 4 times more likely to be arrested and incarcerated if you're black than if you're white, charged with the same crime, with the same criminal background. Today, it is 5 times more likely you be turned down for a bank loan with the same credit, same income. Today. So you do not have to have hoods and people calling you racial names to have racism. Institutional racism still exists. Now, that is not to say there are not some that still don't use racial threats and racial names and attacks, even on campuses in the United States. But those are the idiots that don't know how to do it subtly. We can handle the idiots. What we can't handle is those that have institutionally continued to enforce a racial double standard in this country. Our fathers and your grandfathers fought Jim Crow. Our challenge is to fight James Crow Jr. Esquire. He's a little more polished, a little more refined, a little more educated, but he's just as unfair, just as undemocratic, and must be resisted just as much. But let me hasten to add, we must fight all discrimination. One of the worst things that I saw in the 04 elections was how the right wing was able to win marginal votes off of blatant, unvarnished homophobia. And how many people, even in the African American community, were seduced into some issues that had nothing to do with the election, but based on homophobia went with Bush. I had black ministers tell me, I don't agree with Bush. I don't like what he stands for, but we must save marriage. And I said, well, how you gonna do that? He said, well, we must stop this whole pursuit of same-sex marriage by voting for George Bush. First of all, the president has nothing to do with marriage. The issue of same-sex marriage and George Bush are absolutely, totally separate and have nothing to do with each other, which is why you haven't heard George Bush mention it since he got reelected, because he was able to inflame the fears of those that are homophobic to go and vote for him based on some moral code that he allegedly established and had the Republicans infer that he would preserve. So we ignored the war, we ignored health care, 55 million Americans with no health insurance, we ignored the state of public education in the name of George Bush represents the proper moral code of the country and saving marriage. Well, tell me, I would ask, how does gay same-sex marriage end marriage? Well, it's a threat to marriage as we know it. First of all, most marriages I know broke up more over adultery than gays. So why don't we have a constitutional amendment against adultery? Or why don't we have a constitutional amendment against lying? I mean, if you're gonna have one of the 10 commandments, why don't we have the whole 10 commandments? Where we make it unconstitutional to lie about weapons of mass destruction, by the way. cannot engage, and this is something Mrs. King and I talked about, you cannot engage in any form of discrimination, even if you disagree with people. You cannot engage in discrimination without opening the door for discrimination against you to become valid. We must have a society that appreciates and respects everybody. And you cannot have diversity based on the limits that you accept. You must have diversity based on what is available to society, as long as you're dealing with consenting adults and you're dealing with people's merit rather than people's race, sex, gender, or choices in life. That is what society is built on. I don't agree with a lot of things, but I don't want people to be able to tell me how to worship and tell me how to conduct my personal life, so I do not feel I have the right to impose my will on others. I remember that I was once meeting with a cardinal in New York who is now deceased. And he said to me, Reverend Al, I disagree with some of your stands. I don't agree with women's right to choose. I don't agree with having rights for gays and lesbians. He says, we preach in the church that certain behavior will send you to hell. I said, well, that is true. Some behavior we do preach will send you to hell. But if God gives you a choice of heaven and hell, who are you and I to decide that somebody's got to make our choices? So even if I think what you do may put you in hell, I'm going to fight for your right to get there, because that is your choice. And if we're really going to have a discussion about diversity, and I hope when we get to Q&A people will get into that, diversity is not based on the approval of the majority. Diversity is not the majority sitting somewhere deciding that this is appropriate now based on our appetite rather than based on people's human right to make choices, as long as they're not imposing those choices on others. The challenge of this generation will be whether or not you will meet the challenge of bias, behavior, and bigotry, and racism, and sexism, and homophobia in your time. The challenges are clear. From the Katrina aftermath, it is obvious that we have institutional problems in this country in terms of the governmental structures itself. When you look at the data I've already given you, we still have an unfair and unequal treatment of people based on the color of their skin. If you look at the Latino community and others that face language discrimination, and those that openly act as though if you do not speak the English language, which on an international level is nowhere near a dominant language, that there's something wrong with you and there's something synonymous between democracy and English, which is absurd. Everybody that counted the votes in Florida in 2000 just about spoke English. There's nothing synonymous with democracy and English. We cannot take pride and brag about how we are a nation that honors and respects everyone. And in fact, when they get here, we ask, what are they doing here? We grew up, I grew up, and even down to your generation, you grew up looking at the Statue of Liberty, bring me your tired, your huddled masses that yearn to be free. And then when they come, we ask them, what are you doing here? Or there's a different immigration law at the Mexican border than at the Canadian border. And there's a different way. And there's a different way we treat immigrants from different parts of the world based on the nationality and the race and the language. That is not an America that will be celebrated as a nation that stands for what is right and what is just. We keep hearing people say that we don't understand why there are those that hate America. And they use these inconsistencies and they use these contradictions to incite that hate all over the world. Rather than have this macho, single-minded bravado of bragging about America, why not look at those parts that are weak and correct them and strengthen them so America can be what you profess that you want it to be? Now, let's bring it a little closer to home, and then we'll open it up for questioning and comments. There are those that will engage in racist behavior even on campus. And there have been those reports even here about that. One, I think that it is the responsibility of everybody to stand up against people that are biased and racist and see them for the cowards that they are. Anytime you must write racial epitaphs in the dark, hiding, you are admitting by the actions of operating under cloak that you are a coward and will not stand up and say openly what you believe. And anytime you feel that the only way that you can rise and become what you want to be is by belittling and by bringing down others, then you are exposing more about your own insecurity than others' inferiority. Bringing down others will not make you what you are not. And the problem with most bigots is they are looking for an excuse to blame their own lack of achievement. So it makes one feel better to act like the reason you're not doing well is because there's too many others on campus that's not like you. The fact of the matter is, other people's presence has nothing to do with your ability or lack of ability. Thirdly, the whole idea of those that know of these types and cover for them with their silence are just as guilty as they are. How? How do we break through this? One, we need real dialogue and we need real understanding, and we need the realistic understanding that all of us have made our contributions to this country, and none of us are here out of favor, or none of us are here because somebody did something that was in any way bearing on your advantage or disadvantage to perform. There's an argument raging in many universities about affirmative action. There's even an initiative on the ballot in Michigan to try and remove affirmative action, a case brought by the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And there's a man that is campaigning now that has that ballot initiative that was defeated in California, that is trying now to have this initiative passed to end affirmative action in the state of Michigan. His name is Ward Connolly. The question of affirmative action, first of all, came up, ironically, under the Nixon administration. And it was a conservative remedy to try and close the gap between those historical, racial, and biased admissions of blacks into places of higher learning. The same then was used as diversity programs in the private sector. The same was used for programs of diversity across the board in public service institutions. The reason why government must do what it can to correct a gap is because government helped to cause the gap. You must remember, the gap in higher education of blacks, the gap in employment and the promotion of blacks in the private and public sector was not based on some custom or habit in the South. It was based on laws all over this country. When we as blacks sat in the back of the bus, it wasn't a custom, it was the law. Rosa Parks was arrested for sitting in the front of the bus. It was against the law for us to go to higher education institutions. It was against the law for us to have certain jobs. It was against the law for us to even eat in certain restaurants, or to sleep in certain hotels, or to even use the same toilet. You cannot take government-enforced laws and create a gap and then say that the government should not affirmatively correct what the government affirmatively did in the first place. Then the people come with the question, well, how long is it going to take until the gap is closed? That's how long it takes. That's a problem from 20 years ago. That's like saying, let's not research remedies for cancer. That was a 60s problem. You research it until you solve the problem of cancer. And you research and you keep affirming and having programs of inclusion until the data says there is no sense of unequal between blacks and whites and Latinos in this country. Don't put a timeline on people recovering from what was structurally and institutionally and legally done to them. Then I hear the argument. Well, I'm not responsible for what my great-grandfather did. That might be true, but unfortunately it didn't end with your great-grandfather. Emancipation Proclamation was signed 1863. Went from 1863-65, signed an Emancipation Proclamation, Reconstruction. Promised the right to vote, giving it to a limited degree. Promised 40 acres and a mule. Didn't get the 40 acres, didn't even get the mule. Went through the terror tactics of the Ku Klux Klan White Citizens Council. By 1900, there were no blacks in the U.S. Senate, no blacks in Congress. Jim Crow became the law of the land all the way until 54, Brown versus Board of Education. So we passed your great-granddaddy, now we're into your granddaddy, by law. We're in segregation, in apartheid, by law. My mother could not help me with my homework because she could not go to school in Dothan, Alabama, by law. This is my life now. 65, Voting Rights Act. 66, Open Housing Act. 64, the Public Accommodations Act. You now enter my lifetime. My children, my daughter's lifetime, which is your lifetime, has to deal with the impacts of discrimination in my time. We're not talking about what was done 100 years ago. We're talking about what continued by law, even into our own lifetimes. And even if there are those that are not responsible and did not engage in it, you benefited from an unfair advantage. And you cannot act as if that doesn't count. If you were in a football game and they cheat and they're ahead 24-7 off of cheating on 2 touchdowns, and you wasn't on the field, but you come in the game, if you're playing on an unfair score, you are still taking advantage of who cheated. You didn't do the cheating, but you didn't even the score either. So don't try and act as though it is unreasonable for those that have been wrong to seek it to be righted as they go forward toward a society that is fair and just. So I conclude tonight by saying, I don't apologize for standing up for affirmative action. I don't apologize for saying that the president was wrong in Iraq and was biased in my judgment in his reaction to Katrina. I don't apologize for saying that this country ought to be spending taxpayer dollars helping the taxpayers of this country rebuild the infrastructure of this country and guarantee health care and public education to its citizens. Nor do I apologize for saying that there is still racism and bias alive in this country. But I also don't apologize for saying that we must show the same sense of fairness to women and gays and lesbians, and that this generation must, even on your campuses, demonstrate the ability that your fathers and mothers did not do, and that is to fight institutional bias and racism and bigotry, and to keep the fight going until the fight is won. Not better, but won. As we open the floor, let me say this. At the end of the day, I challenge each of you to do what you can to finish that fight. If you don't choose my way, choose our way. But make your life significant by what you do to add to the coming together of humanity. The only significance that life has is what you do for more than yourself. If at the end of your life, all you have done is just for you, got you a nice job, got you a nice home, got you a nice car, your life will have little meaning. Because when your life is over, and all of us one day will face that point where our life ends, the only thing that will be of remembrance is what you did for more than yourself. Why did the world stop and remember Rosa Parks? No one knew what kind of car she drove. No one knew what kind of job she had. We remembered that when society was unfair, this frail 92-pound woman did what big burly men wouldn't do. She sat down for justice and changed the most powerful nation in the world. Why do we remember Coretta Scott King? We don't know how much assets she left. We don't know how her portfolio looked on Wall Street. We know that when it was time to stand for human rights and human dignity, she put herself on the line. I was flying one night with Martin Luther King III, the oldest son of Coretta and Dr. King. And I told him, I said, you know, Martin, I'm going to tell you something that may sound strange to you, but your father won. He said, what do you mean? I said, I know that doesn't sound right. He was killed before his 40th birthday, never saw 40 years old. Never saw any of his 4 children become adults. Didn't know if they went to college. Didn't know if they married. Didn't know what became of his own children. Never ever saw the vacation spots of the world. Never saw people that he fought for blossom into high office. But he still won. Because 37 years after his death, every January, down in Atlanta, Martin, the schools that wouldn't allow your father to go or closed to celebrate his birthday. In Alabama, the courthouse, where they dragged him up the stairs, called him a tax cheat in handcuffs. The judge can't come to work, the clerk can't come to work. They got to stay home and celebrate his birthday. Who would have ever thought that even in the Deep South, regions that called him the N-word have to stop once a year and celebrate the birthday of a man that stood for something. So in the end, he won. Nobody celebrates the governor of Alabama's birthday. Nobody celebrates the mayor of Selma's birthday. But people remember people that stand for something, and even with great risk, will make it a better world. You may not be popular, even on campus, to stand for inclusion and stand for fairness and stand against bias. But in the end, people will respect you if you stand for something, rather than just get along with you because you just go along with anything. Thank you, and God bless you.